Hi, welcome to this lesson on what is critical thinking. So if we jump to the agenda, so in today's lesson, we will first define what is critical thinking, an important topic more so today than ever, and we'll look at some of the qualities of a critical thinker and present a portrait of one. And we'll also example the importance of asking questions, and we'll give examples of some good questions. And then we'll move on to the questioning approach of two masters of critical thinking, historical figures that you may know, Socrates and Sherlock Holmes. And then we'll look at two activities accompanying this lesson, and then finally we'll review the points covered in the lesson in wrap-up. So let me move on now to defining critical thinking. So do you know that that some of the key qualities that employers are looking for in a job seeker these days, what they are, the key qualities? Well, companies are looking for an employee who can think critically, solve problems analytically, and communicate well in writing, which is a tall order. That's a big challenge. So actually, what does it mean to be a critical thinker? Does it mean being argumentative or critical of other people, a bit of pain in the neck, when I call it PETA, pain in the ass? Or no, not at all. We might begin by saying that critical thinking is good thinking, and we can define it in a theoretical way, which we'll do later. But first, let's look at a situation to show critical thinking in action. Suppose a friend of yours invites you to see the latest Tarantino film. You just decide to decline, refuse the invitation because it goes against your tastes. It's possible. Your friend is curious and wants to know more about your thinking. You tell him that you're not particularly opposed to the language used in Tarantino films or sexual scenes, but you do dislike the excessive violence that Tarantino loves to use. Oh my God. Your friend is persistent and wants to know more and asks you to define excessive violence. He asks you to explain what you mean by this in simple language. And then he also asks you to give an example of excessive violence and show how it differs from other kinds of violence you've seen in Tarantino or other films. You answer your friend's questions and ask him if that makes any sense. So this is the beginning of the critical thinking process. And there are many ways to describe critical thinking, and here's an example from a famous American philosopher, John Dewey. He described it in this way. He said, the essence of critical thinking is suspended judgment. And the essence of this suspense or suspension is inquiry to determine the nature of the problem before proceeding to attempts at its solution. And this, more than anything, transforms mere inference into tested inference, suggested conclusions into proof. So the key words for me in this definition are suspended judgment, tested inference, and proof. Other experts describe critical thinking as an ability, disposition to improve one's thinking by systematically subjecting it to intellectual self-assessment. So critical thinkers apply this skill and disposition to all areas of life, socially, economically, politically, professionally, morally. And critical thinkers are aware of their prejudices and misconceptions, and they're able to recognize their assumptions and point of view. They're aware of the assumptions that guide their decisions, actions, and choices. And they know how to check the accuracy, validity of their assumptions by examining other perspectives, as well as viewpoints and sources of information. And so once they understand their assumptions, critical thinkers can make informed decisions based on evidence or proof. So how does one become a critical thinker? Well, here are some qualities, actually. Before we do that, let's look at some qualities of a critical thinker. A critical thinker is inquisitive, well-informed, confident in reasoning ability, keen on using critical thinking all the time, open-minded regarding different points of view. Not easy. understanding others' opinions, being fair-minded in appraising and judging reasoning, honest about your biases and prejudices and egocentric tendencies. We're all egocentric to some point, and careful in making judgments, as Dewey said, and willing to revise your judgment based on reflection. Very important. So let's move on now to this portrait. If I move on now to him. So those are lofty standards. So how does one become a critical thinker? And how does one develop the habits of thinking well, of reading well, of listening well, of writing well, and of learning well? And so in this portrait, you see that a critical thinker is aware, as we mentioned, is aware of problems, thinks independently, examine issues from different angles, viewpoints, uses creativity to solve problems, which is different from critical thinking. It's not the same thing. And you can communicate well and explain your solutions. Again, that's pretty impressive. So back to the question, how to become a critical thinker, and the answer may be more simple than you think. It's to practice critical thinking consistently. How so? Is to develop a way that put emphasis on asking questions, seeking answers to questions, using information, interpreting information by making inferences, and being aware that our inferences are based on our assumptions, as we said, and our point of view. And so we can ask questions, which is a great tool in thinking critically. And if we look at these two quotes here, the first quote here has to do with effective questioning stimulates your thinking. And asking questions is our most important intellectual tool. It's pretty powerful. So if you want to become good at asking questions, you need to be able to ask questions dealing, let's say, with interpretation, analysis, and evaluation. So here are some questions dealing with interpretation. For example, what does it mean? What's happening? Analysis questions are, what's the reason for making this claim? Or why do you think that? And evaluation questions, and how credible is the claim, and why do we think we can trust what the person is saying? Very important. In another lesson, we'll look at other types of questions, lots of questions you can ask. So let's jump now quickly to masters of critical thinking. And as I mentioned before, Socrates is a master at critical thinking, a real master. And Socrates, for example, Greek philosopher, and we'll also later look at Sherlock Holmes, a famous historical fictional detective. Some people think he's real. Socrates, two famous quotes actually from Socrates that you may be familiar with are, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and "To find yourself, think for yourself." And he used 6 different types of questions, as you can see here, seeking clarification, such as "Tell me more." Probe is to dig deeper into assumptions. Ask for reasons and evidence. Ask about causes. Probe, again, probe the perspectives, and also explore implications, and also question the original question. Challenge thinking and reasoning. And then in the next slide here, you might want to look at the 32nd Socratic dialogue, which has Socrates trying to discover the true meaning of piety in a conversation with a gentleman named Euthyphro. You might want to take a few minutes to look at that. So let's now move to the other great thinker, and that is Sherlock. I love Sherlock Holmes movies, and he's a famous English detective. He always begins his search for a solution by identifying a research question. His goal is to carefully state the hypothesis he wants to test, and using his hypothesis, he then filters all his questions to the victim or the witness. So if we move now to the activities, and if I want to show you a couple of activities that accompany this lesson here. So we have some comprehension activities, and we have writing about Socrates. So here, for example, in activity 1, which is a true or false, consider the following statements if they're true or false. Comprehension of the lesson. Short answer by giving a short answer to these questions. And activity 2 is write a short paragraph about Socrates himself and also the Socratic method. So if we go back to our wrap up. So in this lecture, we looked at several definitions of critical thinking. We also examined the qualities of good critical thinking, of a critical thinker. We learned why question asking is so important and saw some examples of good questions. And we also discovered why Socrates and Sherlock Holmes were such good critical thinkers. So in the next lesson, we'll look at more examples of good question asking. So I hope you enjoyed this overview of critical thinking, and we'll see you again soon in the next lecture. Bye now.